After all of the waves, Kate Baldwin, after the last few months, the first 5 months of the Donald Trump presidency, right, the first 4 months of the Donald Trump presidency, that you expect that Democrats would have this massive lead on the economy. It ain't so. It ain't so. The party that is closest to your economic views, in November of 2023, it was the Republicans by 11 points. Now it's still within that range, still within that margin of error. Plus 8-point advantage for the Republican Party. How is that possible, Democrats? How is that possible after all the recession fears, after the stock market's been doing all of this, after all the tariffs that Americans are against, and Republicans still hold an 8-point lead on the economy? Are you kidding me?
When you hear the term free trade, you might think to yourself, that sounds all right. I mean, after all, who wouldn't want to pay less fees on goods that are traded between countries? However, in reality, all that ended up happening was our jobs in manufacturing were shipped overseas from this nation. And of course, other countries put tariffs on us. So we have this unequal playing field when it comes to that free trade we were talking about. So what we're going to see today, of course, is Representative Brandon Gill totally educating Kaitlan Collins on this very topic. But before we get to these clips, don't forget to like and comment on this video so we can break through the algorithms. Here we go.
Well, listen, I think that there's a huge problem in this country with rogue judges who are overstepping their authority, abusing their authority to usurp the president's power and to thwart the agenda that voters elected him to do, whether it's deporting illegal aliens or instituting tariffs. That's not democratic. And that's a huge problem. And I think that's what the president is speaking out against right here.
But do you consider a judge that he appointed a rogue judge?
Well, I think in this case, I don't agree with the ruling. I agree with the president. I think that this was an overstep of that court's authority. I think that the American people can see that we have a huge problem right now with large and persistent trade deficits. That's a national security issue. That is an issue that falls under President Trump's powers as commander-in-chief of the United States, and he is taking action to alleviate that problem. That's what he's doing here. I don't think that that ruling was proper, in particular given the context that just a few months ago, the Senate took up the question of whether the president had the power in the first place to institute these tariffs. They decided not to stop him. That this is something that the president was elected to do, a power that he has, and I think these judges are overstepping their authority.
Some people might ask, how do you convince a court that it's an emergency if we've had a trade deficit since 1975?
Well, you can have a trade deficit since 1975 that is getting worse and worse and worse, and is also something that culminates into a problem. Listen, there's a major issue in this country whenever our manufacturing base is being shipped overseas, whenever jobs are being shipped overseas, whenever our entire industrial base has been outsourced, whenever we're reliant on hostile foreign nations for key pharmaceutical inputs, for energy, for all sorts of things that we need in our everyday life. These are the kinds of things that President Trump is going after with these tariffs. That, by any measure, is a national emergency. Yeah. It's a problem for our national security, and it's a problem for our economy.
One way to avoid a court challenge would be to have Congress handle this. And Congress has the power to regulate trade. Republicans have majorities in both houses. Why not just have Congress put these tariffs in place?
Well, listen, Congress can do that. I would support it if we could. But that process takes time. The president mentioned that in his post. It would take weeks for us to do that. The president is aggressively acting in our country's interests. Again, doing what the people want him to do as commander-in-chief. That is the purpose of the executive branch, to be able to act swiftly and decisively in our country's interests. So perhaps we'll take that up at some point. But right now, the president put these tariffs in place, and I think that they should stay there.
But on what is your responsibility? Is it regulating trade in the Constitution that it is Congress's responsibility, not the president's?
Congress has oversight over this. This is part of the president's authority. This was a national emergency that the president has talked about at length, that he talked about on the campaign trail, that he's talked about since then. He has the powers to implement these tariffs under his national authority, national emergency authority, and that's exactly what he did.
But Congress could also just implement them, right?
Certainly Congress could, and perhaps there's a role for it. But in this case, President Trump implemented this. These were lawful tariffs.
Kaitlan Collins just loves to ask the same question over and over and over again, okay? Couldn't Congress take care of these tariffs tomorrow? Yeah, potentially they could, but Congress, of course, acts really slow, and the chances of getting all the Democrats to agree to enacting tariffs on other countries are slim to none. So Donald Trump, of course, has the power and authority to enact tariffs, and that's exactly what he's doing. Because back in 1935, you had the RTAA Act, which, of course, enables the president to actually enact tariffs of equal value, called reciprocity, okay? And then, of course, you have IEEPA enacted in 1977, which means that in times of emergency, which is what Donald Trump is often referencing here, the president can enact tariffs. And while a lower district court judge was able to come out and say, no, Donald Trump, you can't do those tariffs, a federal appeals court actually came out and said, yes, he can. He has that authority because we actually have bills on the books that give him that power. And I love what Brandon Gill has to say in response to Kaitlan Collins here, right? If we've had this trade deficit for 30 plus years, why is it an emergency now? Because things tend to compound, right? It gets worse and worse and worse, kind of like our national debt. So it's okay to come out and say, yeah, this has gotten untenable. We're losing jobs. We're losing manufacturing. Other countries are not accepting our products at the same rates, and it's really starting to hurt us economically. Not to mention our national security risk, where we have a lot of our pharmaceuticals manufactured overseas, right? And as I've mentioned before on this channel, in case something ever happens between the US and China, how in the world are we going to get our medical equipment, our medications, right? How is this all going to play out? China's not going to be nice and say, oh, while we're fighting on the front lines, we're going to go ahead and give you what you need to help your people. No, they're going to clamp down, which is why it's very important for national security and the safety of American citizens to have a lot of that stuff brought back to America. Now, to you and me, that makes common sense, but to the left, all they see is Donald Trump bad, tariffs bad, etc., okay? But of course, the left's love to fearmonger when it comes to tariffs, it's no different. So let's go ahead and hear Scott Bessent really owns CNN again.
When you were last here in March, we were trying to gauge what the impact of the standoff with China and with the tariffs on the rest of the world would do for American consumers here at home. At that time, you told us you were going to appoint an affordability czar and council to figure out 5, you said, or 8 areas where there will be some, pain for working class Americans. Where are you anticipating price increases?
Well, thus far, we wanted to make sure that there aren't price increases, Margaret, and thus far there have been no price increases. Everything has been alarmist. That the inflation numbers are actually dropping. We saw the first drop of inflation in 4 years. The inflation numbers last week, they were very pro-consumer.
Right. But you listen to earnings calls just like we do. Mm-hmm. You know what Walmart's saying, what Best Buy's saying, and what Target are saying.
But Margaret, I also know what Home Depot and Amazon are saying. I know what the South China Morning Post wrote within the past 24 hours, that 65% of the tariffs will likely be eaten by the Chinese producers.
So are there 5 or 8 areas that you have identified, as you said back in March, where American consumers will be able to have lower prices or should be warned of higher prices?
Well, a lot of it's already working its way through the system. So we've seen a substantial decrease in gasoline and energy prices. So that's down 20% year over year. We've seen the food prices go down, these notorious egg prices. Through the good work of President Trump and Secretary Rollins, egg prices have collapsed. So we're seeing more and more. And what we want to do is even that out across all sections of the economy. So inflation has been very tame. Consumer earnings were up 0.8% last month, which is a gigantic increase for 1 month. So real earnings minus low inflation is great for the American people, and that's what we're seeing.
But for consumers, the reality is there will either be less inventory or things at higher prices or both.
Margaret, when we were here in March, you said there was going to be big inflation. There hasn't been any inflation. Actually, the inflation numbers are the best in 4 years. So why don't we stop trying to say this could happen and wait and see what does happen?
So this is exactly what I've been talking about, right? I used to actually think tariffs were a bad idea. When Donald Trump enacted them back in 2018, all these exact same arguments were being made, right? The prices of goods are going to go up. It's going to hurt the American people, etc. But when Donald Trump enacted them, guess what happened? Nothing. right? Everything stayed the same, and we actually just started getting in more money. And of course, the tariff idea was so good that even Joe Biden kept it, okay? But now flash forward, and it's the same arguments all over again. And as it turns out, it looks like the manufacturers are going to be eating the bulk of the costs of these tariffs, because as we've just seen in these numbers, yes, inflation is actually falling, surprising all of the economists and talking heads. And along with that, of course, we have a rise in employment, also in defiance of all the experts. Now, of course, these are the numbers from April, but now, of course, that May is over, I'm looking forward to seeing those numbers as well, because guess what? As this happens, Donald Trump himself is becoming more popular, because not only do you have Rasmussen showing that Donald Trump is at a 53% approval rate, now you have Trafalgar coming out with the same thing. 53.7% of the American people actually believe that Donald Trump is doing a good job, and for the first time in Rasmussen's history, we're actually on the right track according to the majority of people here in America. And as Scott Bessent rightly points out, all of the left-wing pundits and talking heads have been saying, oh, these tariffs are going to ruin the economy. They're going to cause prices to rise, only except for the facts on the ground are the exact opposite. Please remember, this country used to run on tariffs. There was no personal income tax. And if we can actually get back to that, if this stuff actually works, that would be a huge boon to the American people. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and say hi to your mom for me. Do you like t-shirts? Of course you do. And now you can support the channel by buying an Angry Teacher t-shirt designed by me, Angry Teacher. So if you like America, if you like freedom, if you like liberty, then go ahead and click the link in the description, where all designs, of course, are 100% mother approved. So enjoy yourself and find something you like today.